Hello, my name is Joshua Dyer. On behalf of the Board of Directors here at Band, I'd like to thank you for joining us today for an artist talk with Kanna Anigbogu for his solo exhibition series, I Do Loose. First, I'd like to start off by acknowledging that the land we are on is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, including the Inuit and the Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. As an organization dedicated to supporting Black and cultural workers, we recognize that Indigenous sovereignty is linked to our collective liberation, and it is crucial that we continue to reflect on ways that we can learn, mobilize, and take action in solidarity with Indigenous peoples and communities. Kanna is a Nigerian artist with a distinctive style of continuous line work, color, and overlay inspired by Igbo folklore. His work combines movement, playful experimentation, and symbolism, creating abstract pieces that tell stories about the human condition. Common themes in his work include ancestry, Black bodies, and tribal aesthetic from indigenous pictography. Anigbogu's abstract characters come from his desire to explore the potential of empty space and the wonders of everyday life. Kanna will be in conversation with Karen Carter. Karen is the co-founder here at Band, a museum consultant, and also the curator of today's exhibit. Again, thanks for joining us.
How are you?
I'm well, how are you?
I'm good. How do you feel about the show?
I feel very excited and overwhelmed with a lot of feelings, but I'm really happy that it turned out this way. And yeah, excited is pretty much what it is.
So we talked briefly yesterday when you came in about that first view of walking in the front door and seeing the Lunatic.
Yes.
And just that sense of the light on the work. Can you talk a bit about that? Because I know you're not an artist with a studio. A lot of artists are artists with studios, as we both know. A lot of artists that are showing for the first time are coming out of studio spaces.
Yeah.
So you're going to talk a bit about just seeing the work under the gallery lighting for the first time?
Yeah, okay, yeah. So while I was doing the work, so when you do these things, you imagine how it's going to look. And you just imagine it, on a wall. But when I came in and I saw, because the way you set up the space, and it's the first thing I saw, and then with the contrast of the piece, and it's black and the wall is white, it just, seeing the character and everything, and then with the way things just set your vision, it sets you up for a story as to what's going on here. It just makes you interested to see the other pieces and everything that's been set up. So yeah, I think that placement is actually a very strong starting point for whatever conversation anybody has or any other question anybody has to ask. So yeah, I didn't imagine it would look that way, but it works. It works very well, yeah.
We talked a bit about strategic decisions that we make at the gallery around how much work to show, the desire for room so people can experience each work together and yet feel like you get to engage with each one as it comes. And I'm wondering if you want to talk a bit about, within that context, the juxtaposition of the pieces that were done in isolation online, digitally, and then the canvas pieces, and how you felt about coming in to see the relationship between the two, because you would have seen them in that way.
Yes.
When you created this body, it went digitally, and then the physical pieces, as you know, also they came in different buckets that you mailed from Montreal.
Yes. Okay. So I would say I was in different mind spaces doing both works. The first one was more. I was also in different positions doing the work, but I think the pandemic kind of made the whole thing a story. So it's like a first part and a second part. But with the first digital ones, with the title of the program, I Do Loose, it was just indicative of my using my method and going with it and saying, okay, now that everything is stalled, everything has stopped, how do you express whatever you need to express? How does that show up? And then when I did that and I sent that in, you said, okay, as fortunate as it was, I was also in a different sort of space mentally and also physically. So when the request to do acrylic on canvas came, I felt, okay, this is actually a very good time to really ask that question again and process and see what comes. And so seeing the digital and the physical ones hung here at the same time, I think it's succeeded in telling the whole story so far. Yeah, and I like the way it's all spaced out, and I'm okay. Yeah, I'm happy with how it turned out. Really.
Talk to us about the title "I Do Loose," because I think it came from our initial conversation with you. I still remember you talking and almost physically moving on the Zoom call, because we obviously couldn't do a physical studio visit. We did a virtual one with you for this after the submission of your work, and we as a team were surprised when we found out the work was digital. We thought we were expecting work to be around you in the room, and it was like, no, they're digital. We're like, what? This is all digital. So maybe talk a bit about the process of coming to that space, because all of the work gives a sense of the physical motion you might go through as an artist in the creation process. I think I've said to you before, they're tapestry-like to me. They look almost landscape-like. I sometimes look at them and picture being in a plane and looking down and seeing landscape. So maybe talk a bit about just how it is you create and how the freedom that is seen in the movement and the work is connected to your own communication and the process of the work and you as an artist together.
Okay, so when I get a piece or when I start something, I'm not usually sure of what the end product is going to be, but I know that something is going to be said. Now, normally, for most people, they think, okay, this is what I'm going to do and this is what I'm going to do. They already have an idea of how it's going to flow. But I do not have that. My mind doesn't work that way. So what happens is that I start with a line, and there's so many things going through my mind as to what needs to come out. And it's that back and forth of you need to relax and have faith, just continue with the line. And then usually a sense comes and says, why don't you do this? Why don't you do this? Why don't we use this color? Why don't we do this? But I have to continue with the line for a certain amount of time and then layer whatever comes next. So that's usually my process. And to answer your other question, what was the other question?
The relationship between, and I think you did in referencing your almost this subconscious then leading to the conscious, because you said you don't have a plan for where the line goes, but the line then leads you to the color and the pattern.
And when people see the lines, it's the first thing people tell me is that it's meditative. But for me, it's not meditative. It's nerve-wracking, because how do you know what you're going to do from just doing lines? So the whole time I'm thinking, when is this going to end? What's going to happen? But eventually something comes, and it's just trusting that as long as you're doing that piece, the piece also wants to be done. So you have to continue drawing the lines, and then eventually something comes, and it's usually the right time for that piece. So yeah, that's my process.
Do you ever, in that process, when you get to the more conscious portion, want to rethink the line, or because their choice is, if you look, for instance, at the blind part of me can't see intuitive, the title, but it's one of my favorite pieces. And you can see where you've done the line, but then you have an overlay. But then there are other places where it feels like the line isn't as it's like, here's the foundation, and then you're layering. And so if there are times where you're like, no, I'm not, because the I can't remember the title.
Idol.
Yes, Idol.
So for Idol,
Which looks the reverse. It looks like you came to the talisman and then you did the line.
So sometimes I may not start on the exact what's it called? I may not start on the exact final canvas I'm going to work on. I may start with a book, but I have to prime. It's sort of priming myself. So by the time I get to that point, there is a certain flow that I can trust. So that now lets me know, what, this piece, you're going to have to start with the paint first. And then I do that. But eventually the line has to be there. And so when I start and then keep going and then trusting everything and then it turns out the way it looks. But usually I have to start with the line. Sometimes I start on the exact piece, sometimes I start with something else and then go from there.
Was there a point for you, because when we first discussed this show with you, you were deep in that COVID process. I feel like a lot of us wind up looking back on this time, and there may be like this journey of ebbs and flows and peaks and valleys during that process of isolation. And we talked again about this yesterday, about those who are introverts and who welcomed the isolation, and those who are extroverts and we're just kind of waiting for it to be over. But was there a place where for you the introvertedness found extrovert moments because of the art, or it felt like it was a way of engaging for you?
How do you mean? Do you mean like was...
I'm thinking of the digital pieces and the colors.
Okay.
And there's the piece, for instance, with the turtle, where it just feels very big and bright, and then there are other tones that are more muted. I think of the bird. So were there moments where, because those were all created, as you told us, during isolation, they're all digital. So did it feel like that was an outlet for you, or were you happy that it was still really cerebral?
No, I think I was happy that it was an outlet, and also like I said, I'm not really sure what usually comes out. So it's usually maybe when I'm done, I'm like, oh, so this is really what needed to come out. So for that turtle piece in particular, the reason it's as bright as it was, maybe it was, when I did it, I'm not really sure how I was feeling. I think I used, because there's a different story behind that one. So I think maybe that story came from a place of, prior to that story, I was maybe feeling really down, and then I started to do the work. And so this story comes back and says, you know what, remember this story that you had with, this experience you had with your dad? And also now that you're in Turtle Island, do you want to make something? Do you think there's a correlation between that and then this? And then that, sets me up on different tangents and how I feel about, that particular thought. And that also affects the colors that I use and eventually put everything together. Yeah, so.
You want to tell us the Turtle Island story?
Okay, I think this was in 2007. So my dad was a priest, but this was before he became a priest, an Anglican priest. He and some friends went for a prayer deliverance session, and they went to a compound, and the leader of the procession went and he says that this family they've had several issues for years. The children in the family do things and they don't succeed. They really messed up things. So the pastor goes and prays, and then he points to the ground and says, "There's something in there. People should come and dig that." And so people come and dig it out, and then when they dig the whole thing, there's a turtle. There's some other stuff, and then there's a turtle. And this is my dad telling me the whole thing. He's like, "And you know that this thing was still alive?" And they said it's been there for a long time, because the pastor said, this thing has been here for a long time. Imagine your whole family going through all these problems for all these years. It's because this thing has been here for that long. And my dad was like very disgusted. He was like, these people and their fetish things. But I remember myself feeling very like, wait, how did the turtle survive like that deep without any... I was more curious about that. So that's why that story came to my mind. I was like, that's interesting. And then it just made me, it also showed me that degree of, the spiritual aspect of things, how powerful the things are. And also in other aspects of culture where you hear, in African stories, where the turtle is always referenced as a particularly wise creature, a particularly spiritually potent creature. And then fast forward to 2015 or today, I'm on this place called Turtle Island that belongs to the indigenous peoples, who I also realize are very spiritual people. So this was my own way of drawing, starting with that story and then creating something that came from that and then referencing the turtle. Yeah. Was
it a foreshadowing almost for you? Like it felt like that story was somehow connected to you, and that journey, the turtle, the reference to where you were, your homeland, and the reference to where you are was a foreshadowing of your own travels in some way?
I wouldn't say that. No, but I just think it was just more a question of what is it with these turtles exactly? Like, what is it? What is this fascination about them that they're very mysterious and that they're very slow and they're just there that nothing is ever as it seems. The way you look at this animal, there's definitely an other aspect to it that certain people are privy to knowing about that is more along the spiritual path. But I'm not saying that Turtle Island is shaped the way it is because of any. I just found that whole connection to turtles and had to play with it somehow. It felt right. It felt right to play with it.
Yeah, it is interesting, and I love your reference to then and that story, and then here, and then that notion of indigeneity, because I think one of the things, and this is something that has come very recently in our presence here at Band, and even in the way the board member Josh gave the land acknowledgement, is starting to recognize that there are African indigenous people who are here, and that notion of indigeneity for continental Africans who have migrated here, that there's a heightened awareness that I think sometimes we miss around indigenous cultures outside of the Americas and the things, the lessons and historic connectivities that are there for us to learn from. And that's part of the reason why when we updated our land acknowledgement to talk about this special place as a Black arts organization, we have to have, because it's, as you know, if you're Black and in Canada, there are indigenous Africans. There are those of descendants of indigenous Africans in the continental slave trade whose histories go back. There are people from the Americas, like there are Black people from all over the world who are living here, and the way they come to that idea of indigenousness and what that means around the land and community and cultural practice and identity it's a complex one, but I think often stories like that turtle story shows you how some of those threads
Connect,
yeah.
the possibility of how they connect. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Should we take a walk?
Okay.
All right, let's see. So we mentioned Idol briefly,
Yeah.
and I'm wondering if we want to go in depth a bit about the piece. The collector who purchased this one was really drawn to it. I mean, I think we've seen that all of the pieces that are sold so far, it resonates automatically with them. So maybe, as you said previously, just a bit more about this and what it represents.
Okay, so this piece is Idol, and usually as I start my process, I started somewhere else. I wasn't sure what was going to go on this, but as I was drawing, I remembered an incident where I went into a spiritual shop here in Toronto, and I remember looking. There was a counter with spiritual, like representatives of different religions. There was Krishna. There was everything. There was Mary. There was Jesus. There was Archangel Michael. And for me, I felt like that was there was a topic being discussed, which is religion. And then I keep looking, but I didn't see any African reference. No mask, no carving. And I remember feeling, okay, that for me, that's when the conversation of representation even went deeper for me, because as much as we're talking about representation in physical space and in physical form, here is another experience of lack of representation in spiritual form. And this is a very important part of life. So I felt very bad. And so as I was doing the line work, something said, remember that day you went to that store and there was just nothing on African spirituality, nothing at all. And I was like, yeah, that was bad. I was like, is there anything you can do about it? Do you want to work on that? I was like, oh yes. So what do we do? And then I started with this. So the reason the head is green is that it's referencing the potency of aspects of African spirituality. And this looks like a carving. It's a representation of an idol, a shaped carving of an idol of African spirituality. And it's holding on to this other piece representing power as well. This color is to represent groundedness, because most aspects of African spirituality are based on spiritual practices of the earth. So yeah, that's how this piece came about. It's just a representation of, and then the lines, I would say, represent Black essence. And then with the white background, again, the reason why there isn't so much conversation about African spirituality is as a result of Western influence. That's why the background is white. So that's what this piece is about.
one of my favorite pieces because of it seemed the reverse. It seemed, as you just said, like you drew the figure with the talisman before you did the lines, and the others felt like you always started with the lines, and that was your base for your layer. So it was curious here how you came to that. So the story of you going into a thrift shop, not seeing these spiritual figures represented for the continent is also an interesting one when you think right now about the conversation of the Benin bronzes and just sacred objects that have been, stolen in war or otherwise through trade that's in museums or in private collections throughout the world. And I think this also resonates for that reason because it's speaking to they're out there, but they're sitting, you know what I mean?
In the wrong place.
which is really interesting. Yeah. So cassava, I will admit, I did not notice the text. And I don't know why I didn't. Someone said to me, what's your text in this one and not in the others? And I was like, what text? And then I realized it was literally written into the piece. I do also love this. I love the warmth of it. There's more. There's a lot more. It's probably one of the denser pieces, I think.
Well, in a way.
Is that wrong, or am I misinterpreting the?
Okay. Let's see. It's not as, I don't think it's as dense as this one. It's not as overly personal as this Idol. This is more nostalgic for me. It's more nostalgia. So the reason it's called cassava is this is my representation of the plant cassava. So as an Igbo person, our staple crop is yam. In fact, we've got this new yam festival. But here's the thing, growing up, I knew all of that in Nigeria, but I also realized that there's also another staple crop, which is cassava. And I would say that cassava is almost more powerful or more staple than yam because we have fufu, we have gari, we have all of that. So, but we don't have a day to actually venerate this particular plant. So I was just here and thinking, and I was missing home, and the first plant that came to my mind was cassava, not yam. And so it made me start a conversation of, okay, so what does that mean as a people, as Igbo people, that if I, who is a descendant of the Igbo culture, I'm feeling this way about cassava, and I'm an indigenous of the land, and I've grown up there, that means that we need to probably change this conversation around what is our staple crop. But that was just based off of my own experience. So this is the color of the bark of the cassava plant. And then when you cut it open, you get this white. And then then these are the leaves of the plant. And then this is the leaf this is what it looks like when it kind of starts to die. And then the reason there's a red line is that cassava has, I believe, cyanide. And so before you consume cassava, it usually goes through a fermentation process for a few days. And so I really, that dangerous aspect of the plant that people depend on very strongly, it's important for me. That I found that very interesting. So that's what this red line represents. And then the white also represents the different forms of, how cassava is consumed, either as fufu. And then the yellow here is also in the form of palm oil, which we use sometimes to prepare gari, which is basically dried fermented cassava. And then there's different kinds. There's usually the yellow ones, the orange ones, and then there's the white ones. And then people also there's also this treat in Nigeria where people, drink gari with water and groundnuts. That's what this blue here represents, the water. And then the black lining around it is just that this whole plant is centered around an experience particular to Black people. So that's why this piece is called cassava. It's called cassava.
Those are all the representations or the direct connections to this
to the plant,
plant.
Yeah.
So the story of language, my favorite. I don't know if it's just the blue of the blue sky. It feels like I could be sitting in the Caribbean, sitting somewhere in Jamaica and looking up in the sky is that blue. I don't know, but I love this one, and the striking contrast between, it's like every color it felt very much a precise choice. yeah, it's gorgeous in its clean simplicity. Yet it feels complicated to me. I don't know. Tell us a story.
Okay, so this one is particularly timely because of the pandemic, and as an introvert, when the pandemic started, I was like, yes, finally, all these extroverts need to learn how to stay more indoors and stop going out. Especially in Toronto, everyone always wants to go outside. Why don't you just stay in? And so I felt, for once, let more people stay inside. But then after a while, staying inside, even for me as an introvert, became very hard to do. And so at that point in time, I had a conversation with a friend, and she is an extrovert. Like that's why this person's head is yellow, because it represents the sun and being outside. So this is the extrovert in the conversation. And from that conversation, I realized, oh my God, these people are really taking it very, very hard to be indoors, even though they're with people, but they're not with people in the way that really works for them. And as I felt, so if I'm feeling this bad about being inside at this point, imagine those who are not used to it, who are not designed to be that way. And so this was just a portrayal of that shared feeling or way of being because of the pandemic and everything going on. I had a conversation with someone, and the person said, the color white is particularly apt because the pandemic made most of us shells of ourselves, and that we're almost like ghosts because we're not sure what was going to come out the next day. People became listless, things stopped moving, and it was really a bad place for everybody in the world to be in. So yeah, that's what this piece is about. That shared moment of, okay, this is really, really bad.
And yet it feels hopeful because of the blue. It's like we're holding on for
it to get brighter. Yeah, for things to get better.
You're going to talk a bit about the detailing at the bottom about was that something about grounding or?
No, for me this was supposed to represent night, and then this was also this. It didn't matter whether it was night or day. Everybody was going to be indoors, and how all of that just fell into place. But this isn't particularly about grounding. No. Yeah, that's what it represents. Nighttime, not being able to tell the difference. Well, it doesn't really matter if it was night or day. Everyone had to be inside. Yeah.
Yeah, I love this one. Anybody questions? Comments?
Yes, I answered a lot of it. The things that really came out for my daughter and I, we were talking, she noticed, I didn't notice it at first, was the difference of the bottom. Why it stopped there. And we spent a lot of time like looking at the directionality of that person facing this way versus the other two, which creates, I think, part of the interesting piece. And I think the contrast of the bright yellow with the unhappy face, right? Like that, and your because that's where she kept on asking. She's 7, so she kept on asking questions like, okay, well, it's so bright, well, why are they unhappy? And then we started talking a little bit more about why they're facing and maybe why they're facing that. Her take was a little bit different.
What did she say?
Hers was more about this person here wasn't treating those people correctly. So they had turned away from that person. So, and again, I mean, I think in the nature of COVID, that may have been a reality. Everybody was unloading their emotionalness in different shapes or forms.
True.
But that's the one thing that she really picked out, is that this person was distinctly different in the bottom, in the sun, but at the end of the day, everyone was unhappy. So she knew that there was some sort of conflict, but she in her eyes, it was that person with the sun that had done something to the other people, and they were done with them. Yeah. So we came back to this one, I think 3 times in the hour or so that we were here. So she really enjoyed this one. So did I.
Thank you. I'm glad you liked it.
I love that's what she sees. I mean, one of the best things about those of us who frequent galleries is the experience of what you see before you get to hear what the artist sees, and then where those two end up meeting and almost shaping the full story. It's like the call and response that's direct or indirect based on what great art should do, which is just make you curious and construct a narrative that allows you to get an understanding of it. And you started them young, which is so good.
Oh, it's been blessed that way.
So this is the piece that when one enters the front door of the gallery, it's the first thing you see. And sometimes people don't understand why we'll say enter from the front.
Right.
And it's usually because strategically you've laid the exhibit out in a way
And it's part of the experience.
it's part of the experience of them not, because we have a backyard, as you know, and you could come through the backyard. Sometimes people come in there hanging out, they want to see the show, but we always say no, start from through the front door, because you want them to get this initial viewing. We talked about that when you came by for the first time yesterday and walked in the front door. It was like, this is the first thing you saw at the end of the hallway.
Yeah, even before you look left or right, it's like boom. It's really, so I'm going to speak. This one is called the Lunatic, and I'm very big on spirituality, apparently. And but yes, so
Apparently.
because all my other pieces, spirit. But yes, okay. So this came about. It's very personal to me. I don't know if you're familiar with Christianity or pastors, and usually what happens growing up in Nigeria, you would have a pastor or someone who comes and tells you they've got a calling to lead the people of God and to win souls for Christ. And as a Christian, what we would do was we'll observe the person and see how seriously they were taking their calling, and then gradually people start following them, and then everybody starts saying, okay, there's something actually going on here. But then I started asking questions, and then things started happening to me, and then I did some research and found out, okay, so how was it in pre-colonial times with spiritual leaders and traditional healers? And it turns out that usually the person would have a sickness, the person would get sick, or the person will have some mental illness suddenly, or they start to have misfortune in their lives. And then to rectify that or to change that, they would take this person to a traditional healer. Now, one of two things would either happen. It would be that either this person is actually a lunatic, or the traditional healer would tell this person that, listen, the reason all these things have happened to you is that you've got an ancestral calling to be a spiritual traditional healer for your family and for the community. And so the person would heal the individual and train them, and then they will start their own practice. So, and this thing continued until the church came and all of these practices were, stopped, or for the most part, reduced or suppressed and gone underground. And then I started thinking, okay, so what happens today if there's an individual who has these same conditions? We have a lot of people with mental illness issues today. And to me, with that inside knowledge, I realized mental illness could be a symptom of something else, right? So what about today with how would someone today who actually has a calling to be an ancestral healer know that? They wouldn't know that because they don't have enough of that cultural knowledge to know that that's a possibility for why they may be having mental health issues, or they may be having misfortunes. Because these things are actually true. There's people who went through these things, and then when they were told that they needed to do certain rituals, and immediately they did the rituals, their lives came back to normal and got even better just because they were able to take act on the insights. So the reason this person's hands are tied is that this is an example of somebody who is going through that transition process, and there isn't anybody to help. They don't have the cultural insight to make the change that they need. And I imagine the person being here in North America, where there is even less cultural insight, having come from Nigeria or from Africa, it's actually bad there, where there's active ways of canceling the traditional methods. And so you come here where there's even less support for you if you're on your own. And so the reason the person's hands are tied, and if you look closely, there's a blue color here, and these are usually and then the yellow is about flashes of insight, because the person is usually very intelligent, very smart, very normal, but then it's almost as though there's an on and off switch. And so for people who are experiencing depression, it's like, what's wrong with you? What's happening? And then if you look closely, the paint kind of is broken and on the person's body, and that indicates like an unstable spirit, a broken spirit, an unstable sense of self, because there's a lot of malaise. These people are usually in pain, they are restless, they isolate even more. They can't understand what's going on with them unless someone comes and tells them this is what's going on. That's what this piece is actually about. So there's usually two things. When it's someone asks what's the difference between an actual lunatic and this, and the difference is that the lunatic goes on, if the person isn't called to be a spiritual healer, they go on to be a menace to the society, and then that has to be managed in a different way. And then the second part is if they're called for a spiritual, if they go spiritual calling, they're trained and then they become beneficial to their society. So yeah, that's what this piece is about. So, but if the person doesn't have access to that training and that information, they're going to continue this way for the rest of their lives, and that's not it's horrible. So, but that's what this piece is about. And then also you've got the lines. Again, this one is on top of the lines because I started with the lines here. If you look closely, there's little characters here. It's a single line. The characters have bodies that are made up of tribal marks, and they all connect again to show the importance of ancestry and lineage, and all of that conversation surrounding spiritual heritage and family.
I feel like that's the perfect note to end on. No, it's profound. It's that sense of your heritage, as you said, family, and a sense of cultural awareness and how the process of healing is also connected to culture.
Yes.
And I think we hear that coming in discussions right now around medical practice. I mean, if you think about naturopathic medicine, for instance, that idea that there is this history of healing that came before Western standards of healing, and that the more aware we are of that, the better we are around holistically helping human beings.
Yeah.
Depending on where they are, who they are, and what the culturally appropriate approach is.
Yeah.
I also loved when we talked about this previously, the connection to the loosing of the hand, because a bound hand, as you said, was a symbolism of that constricted inner turmoil. And the title, I Do Loose, for me then had a different meaning. It wasn't just about the method through which you created these lines and letting them lead you where, but it was also about this idea of cultural awareness and understanding that helped to loose you as a human being in your own particular awareness and of spiritually, consciously or unconsciously being able to walk through the world in a healthy way. Thank you.
Thank you.